back to the Social Psychology chapter. The Social Psychology chapter is the first and only chapter that we cover in which more than one person must be present for you to discuss social psychology. Everything we have discussed so far this semester, the issues of neuroscience, learning, memory, sensation, perception, intelligence, personality, all are related to aspects in which a single individual can be measured by themselves. In terms of social psychology, you always have to have at least two people. And under those circumstances, that changes kind of the way that we look at things, because one of the aspects that always shows up in terms of social psychology that has been showing up in the last few chapters of the semester is the issue of constructs. Basic underlying principles of behavior such as sensation and learning and memory oftentimes are not constructs themselves, or they're not very large constructs. Social psychology is very much a substantial size construct. Every way in which you analyze something is always up for interpretation, and in fact none of the definitions of the things in social psychology necessarily are going to be universal, because as culture changes from one location to another, the manner in which you understand greetings or rudeness or helping are actually different. So there may be a kind of a global interpretation of trying to understand helping, for example, across cultures, but how you would actually define helping in each individual society would actually be different from other societies. As a result, the construct for helping is flexible and has to change depending upon where you are. So the issue of constructs is extremely important in the field of social psychology. The other topic that we talked about in the previous few chapters, factor analysis, is also still a primary aspect here in the social psychology chapter. However, it does not figure as prominently in the discussions that we have from our material as opposed to the issues of constructs. So I won't be speaking about factor analysis very much in this particular chapter, but I will be stressing the issue of constructs much more. So let's take a look at a question regarding the first discussion of what we're doing here. Which of the following is not a social psychology scenario? All right, pause the video and I'll give you the answer in a moment. And all of the above relate to social psychology. The answer is E. The reason why everything in this list applies to social psychology because every one of these things involves multiple people, a minimum of two individuals interacting together. Romantic relationships always have two people. Teacher-student relationships always say two people right there. Playing World of Warcraft online. You are interacting with other individuals through a avatar on a screen and a headset in which you're speaking to other individuals. The fact that you're essentially on a telephone, basically, and communicating with other people does not change the fact that you're interacting with another human being. Sitting alone at a party, that may be one of the more difficult ones in this case. If you were sitting alone in a house which had no people, then there'd be no aspect of social psychology. However, if you're sitting alone in a room filled with people, and so that it almost seems as though you're purposely avoiding everyone, then that is definitely social psychology, because everybody can see how you're behaving, and there's now an interaction between yourself and the others. Even if you're not speaking to each other, it's clear that people see what you're doing, and your behavior itself is actually sending a message to other individuals. So it definitely fits in the realm of social psychology. Now, social psychology is defined in a very broad way. The study of the ways in which humans use thoughts, perceptions, motives, feelings, and behavior when interacting with each other. And there is a little bit of psychology code word in here. Whenever you see a definition for a field of study in which there's a long list of descriptors, thoughts, perceptions, motives, feelings, behavior, really what you're probably seeing is that the intention of the definition is that everything we can think of. That's really what it comes down to. Because when you take a look at what's in that definition, try to imagine any psychology that does not involve thinking, perception, motives, feelings, or behavior. That there is nothing outside of that realm. Now, social psychology is for sure one of the most popular areas of psychology. In fact, I think clinical psychology is probably the most popular area. Social psychology and developmental psychology, as well as personality psychology, tend to be some of the largest areas. And when you take a look at the amount of material that's generated per decade, it's beyond the amount that any one person can actually keep up with. And as a result, what you really see in the field of social psychology today is that people must specialize in particular areas. Nobody is a generalist in social psychology any longer because there's simply too much material for you to cover within a single decade. And that number is just continually rising, and so that it's clear that nobody would be able to keep up with it. And in fact, as we learned from the intelligence chapter, there's no such thing as a psychology genius. There's no way for anybody to have savant level psychology skills and to keep up with this extra information. Just not an issue. Now, the fields of social psychology, because they involve all the activity of your brain, all the various cognitive structures and social activity and physical activity between individuals, there's no one particular system that's actually viewed at just by itself, such as learning or sensory aspects. You're always dealing with a fairly broad construct, and in most cases, the things that social psychologists look at tend to be constructs that allow for all brain activity to occur. Consequently, any aspect of social psychology that you discuss does not seem to have any precedence with respect to any other area. That is, in previous chapters, there were some basic things that we had to cover before we could move on and go to a higher level topic and then on in that manner. Here in social psychology, topics that you cover can be covered in any order, and it would not affect or degrade your ability to understand them, because there's no part of the brain, no aspect of psychological functioning that's ever specifically eliminated for analysis. And this very much is somewhat odd with respect to the entire semester. We're only seeing this kind of broad-based cognitive functioning at the very end of the semester here in the social psychology chapter, in the previous chapter on psychological disorders, and in personality and intelligence. Those are the only times in which we're looking at fully functioning brains operating, and we're not selectively identifying a specific subsystem of activity like learning or memory or sensation or perception. The first topic we cover under social cognition is the topic of attitudes. Attitudes are defined very simply by predispositions or tendencies to act. They simply refer to the way in which you tend to act under certain circumstances. And that's a very simple, straightforward idea. And that idea is simply referred to as attitudes. Now, attitudes are expected to be formed through conditioned associations. So there is a recognition in the field of social psychology that the underlying development of predispositions to act comes through conditioned associations. You generally do not see much work at the current time on conditioning and how it develops into attitudes in the field of social psychology. However, I think it's impossible to ignore the role of underlying conditioned principles, because as we've covered them in the first 8 chapters, the aspects of associative learning simply are always there and modify all patterns of behavior. So there's a general rule in which attitudes formed through conditioned associations generally affect 3 things: cognitions, feelings, and behaviors. So that is the way in which you think, your emotional reactions to things, and your overt patterns of behavior. It's a fairly straightforward idea, and probably the best way to play out this idea to see how it occurs in a practical sense would be to take a look at this video.
A service station off the M42 in Birmingham. We've come here to find out what happens if you create a bad first impression of yourself. What sort of reactions will it provoke in other people? We've asked our polite, well-dressed, well-spoken actor Charlie to show us.
Excuse me, could I give you a pound, please? Could I give you a pound?
No. Why do you want to give me a pound?
I just want to give you a pound. Can I give you a pound, please?
No, sorry.
Please?
No.
£2.
No.
250. I want 250. 265. Sir, can I give you £5? Can I give you £5?
I haven't got any money.
No, can I give you a £5?
No.
No, it's just £5.
No, it's okay.
There's no catch. It's just a pound. I'd really like to give it to you.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. Is this number 3? The examination shall be carried out in adequate natural or artificial light.
Come on. I was sat down having my lunch and reading my correspondence course, and this idiot came and sat down and started looking at me. I said, you have a problem?
Don't have a problem just having a quick read. It's boring here. Really, but I can't afford a paper.
What are you doing there?
Just having a quick read. It looks interesting. I don't know much about lifting machines.
I just thought you'd escape from somewhere. Why don't you just clear off?
Do you mind if I check number 7, point 7?
Clear off.
All I want to do is check point 7, then I'll have a total overview of cleaning lifting machines.
Please clear off.
Suit yourself. Here, look, have a biscuit.
It's very unusual behaviour. It's not normal behaviour. Not without somebody trying to provoke a fight, anyway.
There are rules on how to create the right first impression.
No problem with that.
Oh, sorry, just having a little sip. I had a bit of a dry throat. Sorry.
If you break just one of them, you've got problems. Break 2 and you're doomed.
Would you want to thin out, or do you want me to throw you out?
Sorry?
You would.
Just having a little dunk of a biscuit.
Do you mind disappearing? Or do I have to go and get somebody to make this?
You've obviously got off the wrong side of the bed.
I don't know the side of it at all. Am I standing? No, whatever this is, take it and disappear.
I'll leave you the biscuits.
Take the biscuits. I don't want
Here, take that one.
biscuits. No.
Look, I've dunked it now. Someone might as well have it. You have it.
Social rules guide almost all of our interactions. We'll talk later about how we internalize them as children. Meanwhile, the take-home message is that we tend to resist and get distressed by behavior that violates our expectations of what is normative and appropriate in any given setting.
There, the narrator mentioned the word normative. Normative is a word you're going to hear quite a bit in this chapter. It simply refers to the norm of behavior out in society. Whatever everybody is expected to do is the normative standard. And it'll be a basis for the aspects of conformity that we speak about later in the semester. So let's take a quick look at a question that's related to the material we just covered. Given what we covered in the slides and the movie, do you think it's possible for any human-human interaction to have no predefined attitudes or assumptions of behavior? And the answer there is B. No, it is not possible to have interactions without assumptions of behavior. And the basic reason is this. As a human being, you are brought up with language and culture, and that's going to be true all the time. As a result, you will be taught how to behave under certain circumstances, particular social contexts. And under those circumstances, you will always behave in the manner in which you were trained to behave. So when someone violates those rules because they are not familiar with the context or for other reasons that they may be violating them, that will usually cause a substantial problem in the individual's understanding of what's happening. The next topic we're going to discuss is cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance is very likely a topic you've heard if you've ever watched talk shows. It's actually one of the areas of psychology that oftentimes gets media play. Unfortunately, as I've kind of mentioned about the media, the manner in which cognitive dissonance is described in talk shows is almost always incorrect, at least as far as I've seen it. And I've seen multiple programs on television that talk about cognitive dissonance theory. The idea of cognitive dissonance is actually rather simple to understand. Cognitive dissonance refers to an idea when a person does one thing and says something else about themselves which are incongruent with each other. So for example, if you said, "I'm a good person, I never steal," but then someone points out that there's a bunch of pilfered office supplies in your house from the place where you work. Now there's a contradiction. You say you never steal, you say you're a good person, but you actually have pilfered a lot of material from your job. Now, the original assumption about cognitive dissonance theory, the way it was created, was that recognizing that your behavior is different from what you say about your behavior should cause dissonance. And dissonance simply refers to an uncomfortable feeling where a person recognizes that what they say and what they do are actually different. Okay, now that's an assumption. This is all up to this point purely theoretical. The idea of cognitive dissonance was originally simply a theoretical idea. Now, when you take a look at cognitive dissonance in the way I've described it, there's no guarantee that everyone will show cognitive dissonance. Because if a person feels bad because what they say about themselves and what they actually do are different, that's going to be one set of people from the population. But there are going to be other people that will say one thing, do something different, and if it gets pointed out to them, they won't care, right? There's no guarantee that a person has to feel confusion or uncomfortableness between the fact that they say one thing and do something different. And this is very important for you to keep in mind, because as the idea of cognitive dissonance gets floated around through the media, it's always presented as though everyone exhibits cognitive dissonance, and that's simply not true. However, when people do exhibit cognitive dissonance, there is a much greater likelihood that the person will resolve the dissonance by doing one of two things: either changing their behavior to match what they say, or changing what they say so that it matches their behavior. And I suppose, as you can tell from the fact that one bullet point has a red star next to it, is really the one that is most likely to occur. More than likely, there is a higher statistical likelihood that when someone does actually experience cognitive dissonance, they will most likely change what they say about their behavior rather than changing the behavior themselves. So, for example, When I mentioned an individual that pilfers staplers and pencils and printer paper from the office and they take them home, and you say, look, dude, you're stealing stuff from the office. What they'll wind up saying is, oh no, I'm not stealing. They make me work on the weekend. And because I have to work at home, it's only appropriate that I take this material, like the printer paper, from my office because I have to go home and print from my home office. So it's not stealing. It's actually just the movement of materials into your own house to support your work environment. That's the way it gets described. Now, that would be okay if your boss approves the fact that you take printer paper and staplers and pencils home with you. Of course, if you're just taking them without asking, then it is stealing. And you are simply redescribing what you've done so that there is no dissonance and there's nothing incompatible about your behavior. In many cases, changing your attitude about your behavior is the more likely scenario, simply because it is much easier to change your attitude about your behavior than it is to change your behavior about your attitude. When you think about smoking or other types of drug use, you may have an addiction, even in a reasonably low-level addiction like nicotine or even caffeine. You'll have a low-level addiction relative to other types of addictive substances. If somebody said to you, hey, the use of tobacco products universally is associated with negative medical outcomes. There is no universal application of tobacco products that leads to better health. Either chewing tobacco or smoking tobacco through a pipe or a cigar or a cigarette always have negative medical outcomes. And with that kind of evidence behind you, you would think that a person would change their behavior. But what you oftentimes find is that a person changes what they say about their addiction, so that, in fact, the most likely scenario now, in fact, this is oftentimes the way this is presented on television commercials, is to change your attitude about smoking as not the idea that you are voluntarily exposing yourself to medical problems, but rather making it a civil rights issue. It's your right to smoke if you want. You're an adult. This is your body, and you'll smoke if you want. And so the description of smoking behavior, typically in commercials related to vaping, typically present themselves in terms of civil rights. I'm an adult. I could do what I want, and I decide to smoke. I decide to vape. And as a result, the cognitive dissonance issue is actually resolved, and the attitude about smoking or vaping really kind of comes under the headline of it being a rights issue, and the aspect of the negative medical outcomes is completely ignored. For most people, which of the following are likely related to cognitive dissonance? And the correct answer is E, all of the above. Each one of the answers from A through D all have a potential downside. In fact, oftentimes a significant potential downside. And as a result, for individuals that engage in these patterns of behavior, if you listen to the reasons why they use illegal drugs and risk a conviction or arrest, cheat an exam and risk losing their tuition money for an entire semester because they're given an F by the professor, potentially being caught manipulating others for your own personal gain so that everyone shuns you or recognizes that you're a manipulator and everyone rejects you, or even shoplifting, again, which is another instance where you run up against legal issues. The individuals that engage in these patterns usually describe the patterns of behavior in terms of the unlikelihood that they'll get caught Like if they're smoking weed, I can smoke weed in my house. Nobody will ever know. So there's no problem there. But they're ignoring the times where they have to buy the marijuana, or they might potentially get caught if they're happen to be an offender bender and they have their weed out. And when the police show up because of the car accident, they get snagged. All sorts of ways in which you can kind of play out that story occur for cheating in exams, manipulating other people, shoplifting. They all have a fairly significant downside. And usually for individuals that wind up getting caught and fully punished in some way for any of the activity that they engaged in, they oftentimes feel regret at having done what they've done, and the way in which they describe their patterns of behavior oftentimes changes. If they're truly regretful, then they recognize that they shouldn't have engaged in the behavior and it was their own fault. Some of them still will continue to blame other people and refuse to take responsibility for what they've done to themselves. And those individuals will usually continue on exhibiting the same pattern of behavior again in the future. So oftentimes what you see in a fairly general sense, when people accept responsibility for their failures or the problems they've caused, they oftentimes are more likely to change their behavior because they're recognizing their role in it. But if they do not accept any personal responsibility for what they've done, then they tend to carry on and continue to exhibit the same pattern of behavior. The next topic we cover is impression formation. Impression formation is really all about how you form an impression of somebody else. And this sort of thing happens all the time. You form impressions of people all the time. When you're standing in line at the supermarket, when you're out in public, when you're in a classroom, you always form an opinion of other individuals, which is a completely normal pattern. Depending upon how a person looks, the social context they're in, the manner in which they're behaving, you get an impression of that individual. And it is, of course, directly related to your experience with that individual. So in most cases, what you wind up saying in terms of impression formation is the impressions form a schema, which is a generalized knowledge about your impressions. So the manner or the impression in which you form your belief system about another person kind of sets up a pattern or like a context or a framework, which social psychologists refer to as a schema, which gives you some basis for recognizing other people with similar properties. And you might recognize that as the process of generalization. And that's actually what is happening in this case. Through experiences with people in society, you kind of get an idea of how a person is going to behave. And most of the time, those impressions are actually fairly accurate, and they allow you to establish some reasonable expectations about a person's behavior. Of course, they can be wrong, but they oftentimes are at least generally correct. Now, the primacy effect is definitely a part of impression formation, but the primacy effect is specifically related to the very first time that you meet a person or the very first time you experience an event. So it always refers to the first time. Usually these things are related to meeting individuals for the first time, although they can be applied to scenarios where you experience things to begin with. And so what you'll wind up saying is the primacy effect describes how the initial contact you have with a person generally carries much more weight in your overall schema or impression formation of that individual than does later contact with that same individual. In fact, what you can see as a general rule, as we're going to see in the next video, your impression of an individual may take nearly 8 contacts with that person later on before the initial impression and the later impressions actually weigh out. So to say that there's a 8-to-1 ratio is a reasonable rule of thumb that you can generally follow.
Suspecting member of the
Now let's take a closer look at how quickly we tend to make judgments about one another and the subtle cues we base them on.
We want to learn more about first impressions. How are they formed, and how long does it take? It's a big day for these 3 women. They're competing for a secretarial job starting Monday morning, and we've been allowed in to film their interviews. They've got 15 minutes each to prove their worth. Or have they? We're about to find out how long it really takes to make a lasting impression. The candidates will be facing Judy Fisher, a recruitment consultant with 30 years' experience. We've given her this dial, which is connected to our control room hidden away in an adjoining office. There, we're effectively going to read Judy's mind. This machine will make a trace of her thought processes. If Judy's impressed, she'll turn her dial up. That will produce a trace high on the screen. If she's underwhelmed, she'll turn it down and the trace will sink. Everything will be scrutinized by occupational psychologist Terry Kellard.
Bridget, hello, I'm Judy Fisher. Thanks for coming along and being prepared to do this. We're going to talk first of all, Bridget, a little bit about what you've done and about what you're looking for. Then I'm going to tell you a bit more about the job and we can take it from there.
Great.
Okay?
Yeah.
Bridget's been sitting down for just 12 seconds and said all of 5 words. But her trace has immediately gone up from an average reading of 0 to an impressive 56.
Let's just start with, I've got your CV here.
Clearly she's got a positive impression. That's the most important bit of the interview. That would have been based on what she looks like. She looks like a PA.
Yeah, I like that, and I'm good at that, and I'm efficient and fast, and I do as much of making sure everything's in order as possible.
The trace remains high right till the end, finishing at nearly 100. Bridget's prospects look good.
Well, you seem very focused. I'm sure you will. You've done really well.
Thanks
so
very
much.
That's great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
When anybody meets anybody anywhere for the first time, in order to process information, it is absolutely essential to make a judgment about this person. So essentially what people do is make up their mind about a person and what that person's like, generally within the first 15 seconds.
Lucy, hello, I'm Judy Fisher. Thanks so much for coming along to see me. We're going to just talk a little bit about...
Lucy looks fine, so her trace starts slightly above average, but only just, and it doesn't last.
It was my favourite subject at school.
Listen to her voice. It's beginning to lack expression.
You were there for a couple of
She's
years.
licking her lips, signs of tension.
Long term, something...
At best, the trace is mediocre. At worst, it drops.
I'm interested in alternative health and nutrition, and one day I'd like to make my career out of that.
In what? Doing what? On what side of it?
Well, possibly working from home and perhaps in a clinic as well as a alternative health therapist and advisor.
Lucy's lifestyle ambitions don't impress. Her trace sinks from +30 to -30 in 20 seconds. But the next candidate's trace will sink like a stone.
Now this should be very interesting.
Shopping bags, an obvious mistake. But how quickly and dramatically will they affect her trace?
Valeria, hello, I'm Judy Fisher. Good to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
In 3 seconds, it's plummeted to a feeble -50. Neither Lucy nor Bridget ever sank that low.
Just going to talk a little bit about what you've done.
You notice that negative first impression. That's based on what she looked like. She's slightly overweight, carrying shopping bags, low levels of eye contact, and nothing positive has happened yet.
And on the creative side, you're keen cinema and theatre goer?
Yeah, very
go
much
a
so,
lot.
very much.
What was the last thing you saw in the cinema?
I haven't been for ages, actually. What was the last thing I saw?
And what about your sort of attention to detail? Are you quite thorough?
Yeah, yeah.
Because you have got 3 spelling mistakes in your CV.
Do I?
Yes.
If you convey a bad first impression, you have to work very, very, very hard indeed. There was a little bit of research that showed that it takes 8 positive pieces of positive information before you can overcome a bad first impression. My view would be that even that's very, very difficult.
Unlike the other 2 candidates, Valeria was in fact an actress planted by us without Judy's knowledge.
I'd actually been told by Terry to fidget, to not look her in the eye, to not smile, and to move around in my chair quite a bit, and just be evasive in general.
Looking at the 3 graphs together, Valeria came a miserable 3rd behind Bridget 1st and Lucy 2nd. But look closely at the first 5 seconds. The 3 women have already been ranked in order, and the order never alters.
Bridget, hello. Well done. You did really well in your interview. You were absolutely excellent, and we're delighted to offer you the job. So many congratulations.
Thanks very much.
And the very best of luck.
That's great, thank you.
Bridget's been in her new job for 10 months now and is doing well.
I was quite surprised that it showed the results so quickly, the first 5 seconds, though some of them were very obvious. Valeria was, within the first 5 seconds, was going to have to fight very hard to get better. But first impressions are very, very important.
One lesson from this demonstration: you have only 15 seconds to score a big hit on anyone evaluating you. So plan ahead, put your best self forward, first and fast.
Okay, so based on the material from that video, let's take a look at this question. The primacy effect is related to what? Go ahead, pause the video, read those lengthy answers, and I'll be back in a moment to give you the answer. And the correct answer is D, how initial experiences carry more weight in your long-term impressions. That's what the primacy effect is all about. In fact, you may have actually heard of the primacy effect or first impressions and how they are very important. And that video that you just witnessed explains that in a lot of detail, just how your initial impression actually carries quite a bit of weight. And this, of course, applies for things other than just job interviews. It occurs as a process anytime you meet somebody. A first date, while you're standing in line at the supermarket, when you meet a new classmate in a new semester, when you meet your new professor, whatever it may actually be. That first impression always carries much more weight. And in fact, think about yourself and the people you've met over your life. Do you have significant first meeting experiences that you remember as kind of being funny or odd or something that really turned you off about an individual? Even though you may have met that person many more times afterward, you might still hang on to the memory of that first experience because it was peculiar. Now, the next topic that we're going to go into is stereotypes. And stereotypes is an area of study where you look at how a characteristic is supposed to apply across all members of a social category. And in fact, that's exactly how stereotypes are defined. A set of characteristics believed to be shared by all members of a social category. And this is a very odd way for social psychologists to define anything. Everything we have done for the entire semester indicates that there's always variability in human behavior. To get to the end of the semester and find out that a field of study is actually defining a characteristic in which a belief exists that everybody of a particular category has one particular universal characteristic just is out of line with everything else we've done for the entire semester. And it's important to kind of recognize this issue because it does not fit the way most of psychology operates, because nothing is ever seen as purely universal. Even in the broadest category of patterns of behavior, there's always both biology and environment which modify any pattern of behavior. To expect that any member of any socially defined group has one particular characteristic is just ridiculous, frankly, ridiculous. So if you stick with a statistical approach to understanding stereotypes, they can oftentimes be applied if they're used in a less than 100% accuracy. The problem here that you might initially see or think is occurring is that I'm saying a stereotype could be used, but a stereotype is just a generalized application of a characteristic for a particular group. Usually the word stereotype is used in a very negative manner, but that's not how it's applied here in the field of social psychology. It's simply referring to the manner in which a characteristic is expected to exist in a particular social group. So, for example, you could say, I would expect most college professors are fairly liberal. And you would probably be correct. In fact, even in the data that I've seen on the topic, that would actually be an objective statement that is accurate. Who in society is probably most concerned with Medicare and Medicaid? Very likely the elderly. You know, I don't see a problem being able to identify that as an issue. The particular issue that you talk about, that you might be applying some statistical aspect of an expected character, is perfectly normal. It's just the process of generalization from the field of learning. You have to distinguish between the term stereotype and the degree of accuracy from the more demanding way it oftentimes is presented in the media, where universally in the media the term stereotype always refers to a negative stereotype. And even when there's a positive stereotype about a particular group, that positive stereotype is always inherently negative overall. There's always some negative aspect or negative outcome that comes as a result of expecting a particular group to have a positive characteristic. Stereotypes should not be defined by the New York Times or CNN or Fox News for you. This is a psychology class, and you have to take the term stereotype and stereotyping as it is used in the field of psychology. And so the most accurate way to do this is to refer to it as the general idea that some particular group, whatever group that might be, 12 to 14-year-olds, adult men, elderly females, people who have to use a wheelchair, professional football players, whatever social category you pick, you might expect that there is a particular characteristic about members of that group, and that's all that stereotyping is actually referring to. The negative aspect of stereotyping in the realm of psychology itself, not the media manipulation of the idea, but the approach from psychology, will lead to problematic thinking if the stereotyping leads to the application of illusory correlational thinking. Illusory correlational thinking is something we have not talked about since Chapter 1, when we talked about how an individual can misrepresent a character trait to be in a particular individual or members of a particular group simply because they have been trained to only recognize that character trait in the group and that character trait does not exist in non-members of the group. So to see how stereotypes play themselves out, I have a video here that is related to stereotypes of physical characteristics. Take a look at this, and then we'll have a question about it immediately afterward.
Suspecting member of the
Now let's look at a street scene in New York City that takes an even closer look at how we judge others purely on their appearance. We often judge whether someone is successful simply based on their height.
An American study found business graduates earn $600 a year more for every extra inch of height. And in US presidential elections, the taller man has won 17 out of 21 times. So, to test whether size really does matter, we took two actors to the streets of New York. Marcus and Melvin are almost identical. Same age, similar looks, just one obvious difference. Marcus is 6'4", and Melvin's 5'2". But who looks more successful at work? First, tall man Marcus.
He's a lawyer, doctor, and their accountant.
I would say he's an executive who likes sports.
Probably earns maybe about $500,000 a year.
54, 58, probably close to 60 a year, 60,000.
I would say maybe 100,000 a year.
He looks like a tycoon.
Now short man Melvin.
He's little. Maybe a cook. He's like a cook.
I think he's a quiet guy, and he's not very happy. I think he's having a difficult situation right now.
So he earns about an average income, nothing fancy, but enough to live on, yeah.
Minimum wage, I guess, 20,000 a year.
On average, they credited Melvin with a meager $20,000 income and Marcus with a whopping $220,000. All thanks to a difference of 14 inches.
I wish I was his size, to tell you the truth.
In spite of what we may tell ourselves, attributions like IQ or status can depend on totally unrelated personal features, such as being tall.
Which of the following factors was most important in the height and salary movie? And the answer there is D, stereotypes. The idea is that the characteristic of success is associated with taller individuals is the primary issue in this particular case. Now, where would the idea that taller people are more successful come from, right? That's certainly not something that your parents ever taught you explicitly, right? Nobody ever has a story where as a child your parents sit you on their lap and they say, okay, little Timmy, you remember tall people are always better than you, right? That's not a thing that happens unless it's a tall family, maybe. Well, where the idea comes from is essentially from mass media again. The idea that a person who is very successful is tall is always a characteristic of individuals in movies. So you're not taught explicitly that tall people are successful. However, you do see that heroes in movies are almost always tall. And they're usually thin as well, but they are typically tall, possibly muscular. And why that characteristic is there is essentially due to the way in which movies, television programming, and so forth has to take place. If you're going to spend $5 to $10 million making a movie, which you're going to put in first-run theaters around the nation, you have to take every trick you possibly can from the movie-making industry to be able to express the storyline that you're trying to get across, right? The basic plot line, to be able to control what the viewers see and what they think is actually going to happen. And so generally, what you wind up seeing is that the most successful individuals and the people that oftentimes play out the role of a hero tend to be tall, slender, and muscular. Now, no one tells you this specifically, But after 20 years of watching this kind of stuff through the general media, you begin to simply become biased toward taller people because they are always associated with success. And it's a simple learning association, right? A basic Pavlovian connection between a person's physical attributes and the things that they are associated with. So by the time now, as an adult, you look at a video regarding height, you would have a bias toward expecting the taller person to be more successful than the individual that was shorter. It's somewhat of a contradiction in terms of mass media, that through mass media you generally get a very liberal interpretation of society where everybody's supposed to be held equally of value, yet mass media is also the place where the greatest number of stereotypes come from, because every movie, every television program, storylines in novels and so forth, all require the writer and the producer of these stories to use stereotypes as a way to tell their story. And then, having made $15 million by starring in a movie like that, the male lead actor, the female lead actor will come out, and then you'll wind up seeing them on YouTube or some other place saying stereotyping is wrong, racism is bad, sexism is a bad idea, you shouldn't be doing any of these things. Yet those individuals literally make millions of dollars by teaching everybody stereotypes when they play as actors in these movies. Rather substantial contradiction. And it may be something that you should pay attention to, because the same media sources that give you liberal interpretations at the same time also give you very stereotyped information. And so oftentimes things look like they're very haphazard on television. The reason these things exist is for completely different reasons. Plot lines are stereotyped because there's only an hour and a half, 2 hours that you can tell a storyline in a movie, and you have to make your point, so you rely on stereotypes. And for other reasons, you have a very liberal media system which tries to describe everybody as equal and anyone who stereotypes as doing things inappropriate. But the fact that a movie will come on that same television channel that stereotypes everybody in society will take place anyway. Now, the next topic we talk about is attribution theory. And as you might imagine, a number of these topics that we've been talking about, like attitudes, impression formation, cognitive dissonance, primacy effect, they all overlap with each other a little bit. And that makes perfect sense in the field of social psychology, largely because we're talking about the fully functioning brain. We're not cutting any particular system out. We're not isolating any particular thing. We're looking at the overall output of a human being if all the parts of the brain are functioning normally. And these are the things that a human scientist find are relevant characteristics with respect to that broader construct of what you're looking for. Now, in terms of attribution theory, which will overlap with the things we've already been talking about, attribution theory is all about how you form attributions or characteristics about other people. So, for example, if you're standing in line at Starbucks to get a coffee, and when you're in line, you could look at the other people that you're around and ask yourself, why are these people here? Why are they here now? Why are they dressed the way they're dressed? Why are they ordering what they're ordering? And these are just simple questions you might ask yourself. You might not even do it explicitly, but there are going to be associations between the people that you're around and their patterns of behavior that they're exhibiting, like how they wait in line, or whether they're talking to other people, if they're using their phone, or if they take a long time to order, or if they're very efficient about the whole process. All these characteristics kind of get tied together. And so what you see in terms of attribution theory is, again, attributions are established through conditioned associations. And just like with impression formation, I am not aware of a lot of very specific work being done in the field of conditioning that is directed toward attribution theory, but the general understanding of attribution theory is that it is based upon underlying conditioned associations. These associations are going to lead to things called self-fulfilling prophecies. And self-fulfilling prophecies are probably just what you think they are. When you think something is true, you start to make that thing actually become true. And I know that you have to be careful how you say that, because some people use that type of idea inappropriately. Like, if I think I'm going to be rich, then automatically I'm just going to become rich. So really, I don't have to work hard at becoming rich. I'm just going to sit at home like a lazy slob and tell myself 10 times a day that one day I'll be rich and I'll become rich. And that's a ridiculous idea. People make videos like this on YouTube where they talk about how if you just believe it, it'll simply happen. That's obviously not true. There's no reality to that at all. However, in a more realistic sense, if the characteristics that you believe you have become consciously identified, so you explicitly make these comments like, I'm really not very good at math, or I'm a very helpful person, and you make those comments to yourself over and over again, because you are consciously aware of those characteristics that you're making, you begin to respond to them. So when you refer to yourself as a helpful individual and you say it explicitly, you become much more aware of your own helping behavior, and you tend to help people more often. If you tend to help people more often over the course of years and decades, it's very possible that you might become a very, very helpful person, and people will recognize you as somebody who's always willing to help. You simply change your own behavior by having identified consciously some particular characteristic by which you become sensitive to because you're consciously aware of, and then you begin expressing that pattern. Same thing happens also in a negative sense, like with math skills. Many people don't like math, and they will just automatically rule the math out as a possibility, as a major or anything that they're actually good in, because they've had trouble with it in school. And so they say, I hate math, I'm no good at it. And once they say, I'm no good at math, will they ever try doing math again? Not likely. You know, some people will recognize the failure that they have in doing math, and then they'll work to get better. Many other people will just accept it as a limit. I'm not good at math. I don't have good math genes. And that's what they'll attribute it to, some basic underlying personality characteristic, which very well may be related to genes. I simply don't have a mind for mathematics. Or the other possibility, my math teachers in grammar school were awful and I never learned anything, so now I simply can't do math, and I'm not willing to go back and redo all the math that I was supposed to have done to be able to do well in math now. It's that conscious expression of a characteristic that becomes highlighted simply because it is expressly made by an individual. Now, this self-fulfilling prophecy is very clearly does occur with single individuals. It can also occur when you apply the self-fulfilling prophecy to another individual. So, for example, in the example we're going to wind up focusing on, if a teacher believes that a student is not very smart, the teacher, even though they may not be doing this consciously, they may inadvertently treat that student a little bit less carefully regarding the child's ability to learn, and will simply accept that the kid can't learn very well. In other cases, if a teacher thinks a child is smart, that teacher may focus more attention on that child and give that child more opportunities to learn. So for example, imagine a teacher thinks a student is not that smart. If the student raises their hand and asks a question, the teacher might have a little bit of a tendency to think of it as not a good question. And if the student takes a long time to answer a question, the teacher won't think about the student as dwelling on the topic because they want to give a quality answer. They might just think they're stymied and don't understand it and we're not getting anywhere. But if you got the exact same behavior out of another student that the teacher thought was smart, so that they raised their hand and the student asked a question, they wouldn't see it as asking a question because they don't understand, but instead, because the teacher sees that student as smart, they will think of it as the student is asking a question because they're engaged in the class. They simply have a different way to perceive what's actually happening, despite the fact that the two students are doing exactly the same thing. And that is a very important point about social behavior with human beings. If you can classify a person as smart or dumb, good or bad, efficient or inefficient, you may begin treating that person and perceiving them as that characteristic. And as a result, that person may actually start to exhibit that particular characteristic over time, which will then fit the self-fulfilling prophecy, because you start to give that person the characteristic based upon the way that you treat them. And this is a very, very important issue that oftentimes leads to a corruption of how people are viewed. As you might imagine, this aspect of attribution theory and self-fulfilling prophecies ties in very well with the whole aspects of negative stereotyping that we talked about earlier, and the likelihood that illusory correlations will actually feed the stereotype and thereby establish the self-fulfilling prophecy. So these characteristics across these various slides mix together to form particular relevant characteristics of social behavior. And in fact, there's a very nice movie to take a look at that's related to this whole issue that I'm not going to preamble on. Let's just get right into the video itself.
Suspecting member of the society.
In 1968, a third-grade school teacher, Jane Elliott, demonstrated these effects with our elementary school students in Riceville, Iowa. This became a classic study known as the blue eyes versus brown eyes. Jane now runs workshops on diversity for adults. She creates events that often surprise participants with how tempting power can be and how tempting it can be to abuse it.
When I do this workshop, I see the worst of people. I see their willingness to go along to get along. And I also see people who enjoy being on the top.
These 24 volunteers don't know it yet, but within the hour, Jane will have turned them against each other. Half of them will be made subordinates and the other half her allies. She starts by dividing them into two groups according to eye colour. Blue-eyed people like this man are made to wear humiliating collars.
Now take all your junk and go over there until somebody takes you where you belong.
And sent to a locked holding room. Those with brown eyes are treated like old friends.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, not too bad, you okay?
The blue-eyed group are kept under guard.
You people are all brown-eyed. That means you are superior to these people who are not brown-eyed. I expected them to change, and I told them in what ways I expected them to change, and they went along with that. Who's going to force them to fail? We are. I'm glad you didn't say you are. I'm glad you said we are, because we are going to force them to fail. And then, on whom are we going to blame their failure? Them.
So when the blue eyes are finally led in for a series of demeaning and pointless reading and writing exercises, during which Jane will browbeat and ridicule them, what will the brown eyes do? Will they behave abusively and without compassion just because they've been told they can?
I think I was putting the blue-eyed people down because we'd been coerced, in a sense, into believing that we were supposed to be working as a group, holding the power, and to be intimidating. So that's really what I was trying to do, and maybe part of it was because I was enjoying it a little bit.
Next.
If I have but one life, let me live it as a brown.
Did you ever hear that before?
You speak more
That
clearly.
was a minute ago.
You sure did some. But the first person who read that one, please stand. Now, do you really think it bears repeating?
I didn't listen.
Perhaps surprisingly, Jane's harsh treatment is effective in dividing the groups. Moreover, how you are grouped can affect your performance. Back when Jane divided her third graders, I analyzed the scores on the daily math and spelling tests. Both scores went down when the children were in the inferior position.
Might that be rather interesting? Okay. Next.
But the scores went up above the usual level when they were in the superior role. This is stereotype drift down versus stereotype lift up.
In the end, the blue eyes have their say.
I was angry about all the comments that were coming flying over, and I wanted to strike back. I wanted to get up there and give to them as good as I'd got from them.
Yes, it's called the desire to get even, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, you were feeling like you wanted to turn the tables,
Absolutely.
so it was your turn.
Absolutely.
Based on the material in this particular video, let's go through a question. Actually, it's a very general question. I understand that socially biased situations may either benefit me or harm me, and that these scenarios are most often created through random processes outside my control. Well, I'm not going to wait for you to answer this one as yes or no. This is really an issue that you should recognize does exist, because as stereotyping is discussed and impression formation and self-fulfilling prophecies, their role connected to illusory correlations are all made in these various slides in the social psychology chapter. It is always the social context which is establishing whether or not you, specifically you as a person, will do better or worse. And it depends upon the context in which the characteristics are actually being played out. So in most scenarios, there's going to be a degree of similarity between the individuals in the group and how they're treating the other members of the group. If you happen to be the one engineering student amongst a group of psychology students, there might be less likelihood to engage you in conversation. People might not feel as close to you possibly, or as readily to discuss experiences at school. There's any number of different things that can happen, but then once you're across campus with your engineering friends and one of these people from psych walks by, the reverse is going to wind up happening. So it always depends upon the context. There is no universal standard by which a stereotype, a negative stereotype bias is actually going to play itself out. It always depends upon the context and how the people are behaving in that particular group. So it's another one of those failures, frankly, in the general media, in the way stereotyping is actually discussed, because it is always made as a very simple thing. It's always males versus females. It's always white versus black. It's always rich versus poor. Those are your basic stereotypes that hold true in terms of bias, and it simply is not true. If you want to understand human behavior, you have to delve down deeper into the processes that make things operate, and you're doing that now. But that should give you enough of the logic underlying this so that you generally don't believe that social biases always function in one direction and never in the opposite direction. That is simply not true. If you change the context, if you change the way people are behaving in that context, then you're going to wind up changing the direction by which the bias flows. Now, another question related to this whole story that's related to self-fulfilling prophecies is played out in this particular video. This one, as most of you are freshmen in college, should make sense to you because here you're interviewing a bunch of high school students.
Suspecting member of the
In this segment, we meet students from a school in England who have modified their required school uniforms to create subgroup identities with small, distinctive features.
George Abbott School in Guildford, Surrey, has nearly 2,000 pupils who all live within 10 miles of here and are from mostly similar backgrounds. Like all school children, they're divided into groups for lessons, but come break time, they divide themselves.
If you just look across the playground, you'll see that everyone pretty much looks the same. They're all wearing the same uniform, they're the same age, they all have the same accents, they're all the same colour. There's nothing much to distinguish them. So one of the things that's really important to them is to make some differences, to give themselves a sense of being distinctive. And the way they do that is to join different groups and to mark out very important but small differences between each of the groups.
We've been named as the Indie Girls, the four of us. We all wear the same stuff, we're into the same music. There's another group of girls, another large group of girls who are very well recognised, very well known, called the Tracys or the Tarts.
People call us like the Tarts girls, but I don't know, it's because we don't, I don't know, we like to make them like to look after.
We're not subtle, are we?
If you wear socks, you have to roll them down. Right. Your skirt's got to be like skin coloured tights, whatever. Skin coloured tights, so you look
shirt in at the front, out the back.
And then it comes out a little bit at the back.
No jumpers unless you're absolutely freezing. Otherwise, because that's what the indie chicks do.
Group of boys in the corner, which we call the grungers, all wear baggy clothes and reputation for being dirty.
The grungers are more like into snowboarding and skateboarding and stuff, like extreme sports, and so kind of more cutting edge.
Up in the cages, where they play football, is another group of boys called the Garys, who are like the opposite to the grungers.
All the Garys hang out here and they hang out down there. This is sort of like our place and that's theirs.
The grungers won't go anywhere near the Garys because it makes them look as if they like football and they like to wear like gold chains and all that lot. And it's the same way around, the Garys wouldn't want to be near the grungers because it makes them look as if they smell.
We don't smell.
What's this?
Much.
13 is a really important age when children are really beginning to figure out who they're going to be as adults. They're figuring out, what should I wear? What should I listen to? What should I be interested in? How should I behave? They're moving from that comfortable time of childhood when they could just do what all the children do to now a kind of transitional period, and there's a lot of uncertainty around for them.
There's even more uncertainty if you're someone like Anna, who's what the rest of the playground call a loner, someone who's not part of a group.
I'm independent and everything, but I do sometimes feel that it would be nice to be in a group, to have somebody else always there to protect you, to stand up for you. I get names called at me, but it doesn't really bother me that much, because if they feel that they have to pick on me because I'm not like them, then it's their own problem.
Anna's proud of her independence and ability to mix, but without realising it, even she's part of a group of loners.
Sometimes these groups are real groups, like these ones out here, like the grungers, for example, and they all sit together and they do everything together. Other times they can be groups that are more kind of in our heads. So some of the people out here, for example, might be treated as loners or counted as loners, but you'll find that they themselves have connections that give them that sense of security, the sense that they know what they're doing the right kind of thing.
The loners have bonded just like the grungers, the Garys, the Indies and the Tarts, and they display all the hallmarks of group mentality, like loyalty and competition. Anna even says it herself.
They're really nice people and everything, and they've got such nice personalities, it can actually be better than some of the people in groups.
So instinctive and subconscious is this need to belong that we're loyal to groups without realizing it, and they change our behavior in powerful ways.
Based on that video, let's take a look at this question. Given how conditioning principles can be the basis of self-fulfilling prophecies, do you believe that others might have expectations of your behavior based upon previous people they met which they perceive are similar to you? The answer there is definitely yes. Depending upon a person's learning history, they may perceive you one way or another way, and that is completely out of your control. You have no bearing on that whatsoever. In fact, you should have an external locus of control regarding that issue, because you don't have control over the learning histories of other individuals. When that person meets you, they may see you and immediately recognize you as a good person, or as a bad person, or as a lazy person, or as a happy person, as a joker, or somebody who's serious. But a lot of the decision making regarding how they perceive you is going to come from a network of associations that they have already formed with individuals that they have met days and weeks and months and years before they ever came across you. Now, considering the way in which we've been talking about attribution theory, there are a variety of ways other than self-fulfilling prophecies and stereotypes that attribution theory can be applied toward. 4 of those ways are actually here on this particular slide: defensive attribution, belief in a just world, self-serving bias, and the fundamental attribution error. Each of these categories has some fair degree of overlap with the others. So if you begin to see overlap between the others, you are on board. There definitely is overlap between them, but they all apply in slightly different ways. There is one key thing about these 4 specific components of attribution theory, which I can help you understand it a little bit more easily, because these 4 are not completely separate processes. They can all be understood by taking from a vantage point this particular view of an individual. Assume everyone generally treats themselves as though they are the best person in the entire world. Okay? Now, this is kind of a theoretical assumption that you apply to everybody, including yourself. Even though you may not sit around explicitly doing this, you're going to see how this is going to play out. Assume every person thinks that they are the best thing ever, and as a result, always wants to protect themselves from anything bad, whether it's actual physical harm or even the belief that harm can come to them. And that last part is very important. The belief that harm can come to them is where you're going to see this attribution theory aspect play itself out. So let's take a look at defensive attribution. Defensive attribution is defined as not attributing others' behavior to external attributes because you may react the same way. So for example, I know that's a little bit complicated, but what this actually means is this. When you see external or internal attributes being referred to on this slide, external attributes mean, just as we've talked about them with external locus of control, things that you can't control. It might be a physical event, or it might even be a psychological aspect of something that you're afraid might actually happen. Now, in defensive attribution, what you're doing is you are taking a scenario in which another person becomes harmed, and you re-describe it so that the person who was harmed is responsible for what had happened, and that it did not occur by random events. Here's an example. Assume you see your friend, and your friend says, "Oh my God, I just got into a car accident." And you say, "What happened?" And they say, "Well, I was the only car on the road. I pulled up to a red light, and I was sitting there with my foot on the brake. I'm not doing anything. I'm just waiting for the light to change. and some car comes up behind me and rear ends me. And you think, I wonder what my friend did to cause this accident. But they just told you they were sitting there at the red light, perfectly still, no other cars on the road, not doing anything. The light is still red, and somebody comes up and rear ends them. That sounds like as much as outside of their control as possible, yet you're trying to understand what had happened as their fault. That's what this defensive attribution thing is. In defensive attribution, if you come to recognize that random events in the world can cause you harm, then that undermines your greatness. As a result, you will then always look for reasons, internal reasons why people get hurt. And when I say internal reasons, that's things that the person is responsible for themselves. So even though you might not say this to your friend, you might start wondering, I wonder if they got rear-ended because they're just exaggerating. Maybe they were rolling forward a little bit. Maybe they had taken their foot off of the brake and the person behind them thought they were going to start accelerating, but that they didn't, and that's why they got rear-ended. Maybe there was something else that they did, that they were sliding up and stopping, sliding up and stopping, sliding up and stopping, and got into the intersection and then hit their brake really fast because the light still hadn't changed, and then the person behind them got confused by their behavior and rear-ended them. But what you're doing is constantly trying to find a way to attribute blame to your friend so that you can say the car accident occurred because of their stupidity. Which means that you can say about yourself, this would never happen to me. And this is where the defensive attribution is coming from. You're redescribing this event of random occurrences that led to damage to your friend's car in terms of your friend's fault. And because you will never admit to doing anything stupid, because remember, you're the greatest thing that ever was, you now feel protected from having somebody rear-end you on the street for no good reason. To say this in the simplest sense, by finding blame with other people and why they caused their own problems, you always feel as though those things will never happen to you because you always say you're not so stupid as to let those things happen. That's exactly what defensive attribution is, right? So in the end, you feel better about the world because you are largely taking random negative events that occur and redescribing them in a way that other people made them happen to themselves, which can always be used to remind yourself how you and your greatness will never experience these things because you would never do anything so stupid, right? Notice how the process of blame is making a person feel better about themselves. And you're going to see this happen over and over again in terms of attribution theory. Let's go to the next one. Belief in a just world. Belief in a just world is generally applied whenever bad things happen to other people, which, by the way, bad things happen to other people in defensive attribution, and this is generally a process kind of underlying a lot of attribution theory. In the belief in a just world, if something bad has happened to somebody else, you say, well, you get what you deserve. You made your bed, now lie in it, right? Why are people homeless? Well, they made a whole bunch of bad decisions. They made it that way themselves, right? They made bad decisions. They caused themselves to be homeless. They gave themselves a drug addiction. They got themselves thrown out of their home. It's everything that they did that they were responsible for. And because you, in your greatness, would never do such stupid things, you could then feel better about the world because these bad events will never happen to you because you'll never make a bad decision. Consider with the heroin problem that's occurring in the country today. In many instances, individuals may have no addiction whatsoever, not even be people that use alcohol on a regular basis, but they might wind up having a medical intervention, some type of surgery, and the medical doctor prescribes them oxycodone after the surgery. The oxycodone is something that the person becomes addicted to very rapidly. And so they use up the oxycodone, they try to extend their prescription. Eventually, the pharmacy's not going to extend the prescription anymore because the doctor's not going to write it any longer, but they're already addicted to the oxycodone. So what do? They find out that they can get heroin. And because they're already hurting, because they're already addicted, some people will actually start to get illegal heroin. And as they start to use heroin, which is of course highly addictive itself, they begin spending more and more money on it. As they're oftentimes intoxicated, they might lose their job, they might lose their spouse, they may get kicked out of their house, and then they wind up homeless. And that's when you drive past them in your car coming home from school and you look over and you think, damn, what a bum. What a lousy bum. What a bunch of stupid decisions this person made, right? This is the belief in a just world. You made your bed, now lie in it, right? And that person's bed is a cardboard box underneath of the turnpike. Go ahead and lay in your stupid cardboard box, you idiot. You made this happen yourself. But you don't take a look at any of the realistic ways in which a person may have actually wound up homeless and drug addicted. You know, their life may have been going on perfectly normal, but some random medical intervention for which they trusted a medical doctor to take care of them led to an addiction. And as a result, they wind up eventually homeless, drug addicted, and jobless. Self-serving bias. In the self-serving bias, you're kind of applying two sides of the same story that we've already been working with. Whenever you are successful, you apply thinking about those successes to internal reasons. And whenever you experience a failure, you always apply reasoning in terms of external events. So for example, you're a student, so these should make sense to you. If you take an exam and you get a 92, you'll leave that exam and you'll think, that's right, I got a 92. I'm so smart. I studied really hard. That material made a lot of sense to me. This was easy. I got a 92. But if the next time you take an exam for the same class, you come out and you have a 47, the first things out of your mouth are, that damn teacher put a bunch of questions on the exam that had nothing to do with what I studied. The questions weren't even sensible. They were written in a way that I didn't understand them. This 47 that I got has nothing to do with my ability to understand the material. This is not my fault. And when you apply both sides of this, that's referred to as a self-serving bias. So as you might imagine, you can expect to see the self-serving bias with individuals in a variety of different ways, and because it gets applied in a stream of behavior over vast periods of time. You know, as a student, every time you do well, you congratulate yourself. Every time you do poorly, you blame your teacher or the exam, the fact that you didn't get enough sleep, the fact that there was too much traffic and you got to school late, or some other thing that was outside your control, an external reason that caused you to fail. The failure is not because you're not smart enough, it's because of something else. But whenever you do well, it's always, always, always because of you, because of how smart you are, how good you are, how intelligent you are, how well you can study, how you are productive and organize your time and get to school on time and Don't forget to bring a number 2 pencil on the day you have a Scantron exam, and you always have your Scantron. You don't forget anything because you're organized. You always congratulate yourself on how well you do. Again, when you mix those two things together, what you start to see is that an individual has this perception of the world that they are successful if they are allowed the opportunity to be successful, but that they fail when the world interferes with their events, with their attempts to succeed. Now, the fundamental attribution error is the last one we're going to look at, and this is a process by which you overestimate the internal reasons for other people's behavior. Now, for sure, this mostly applies in scenarios where other people are experiencing negative life events. So, for example, your friend gets in a car accident, so you overestimate their internal reasons for what had happened in the accident, right? That is to say, you look to find ways in which you could describe the car accident as being their fault, internal reasons for your friend. So you find blame for them. But you generally don't find the fundamental attribution error generally being applied when good things occur to other people. So if your friend wins $60 million in the lottery, you don't say, oh boy, my friend's so smart, they really know how to pick numbers for the lottery. I'm going to have them pick numbers for my lottery ticket next time, and maybe I'll win $60 million. Now, generally what you wind up seeing is when negative events occur to other people, individuals will tend to focus on why those events are because the other person made some sort of mistake and brought the problem onto themselves. So what we're going to do is move on to a question related to this issue. Look hard at the previous slide. What is common about the set of 4 factors you see? Okay, so I will hold off a moment, give you an opportunity to roll the video back, take a look at it, and then I'll come back with the answer. And of course, the correct answer is D, all of the above. Because in all these cases you see, in A, a focus on whether other people control their own behavior. That's the internal-external locus. When bad things happen to other people, you always apply an internal locus of control to that individual. Poor logic, because again, you're not actually applying logic very well. You don't have an open mind. You have a select way in which you're going to apply blame against other people, or internal versus external attributes, whether or not good things or bad things happen to you. And last, a predetermined and highly predictable pattern of behavior, which is probably the most important part of this, being that we're talking about social psychology. There is a very high likelihood that you can predict how somebody is going to behave in any of these scenarios when you flip back and take a look at all of these aspects of attribution theory. The defensive attribution, the belief in a just world, the self-serving bias, and the fundamental attribution error. In scenarios like this, especially in the context when bad things happen to other people, you can almost always identify ahead of time how a person is going to describe what has happened. Our last slide is to talk about how the self-serving bias and the fundamental attribution error are adaptive or maladaptive responses for people. So for example, as I've been describing it, there is a lot of problems with thinking this way. Poor logic, very predictable patterns of behavior. It doesn't fit a basic understanding of a rational human being. However, the fact that it is so consistent indicates that there must be something good about it, because that's a basic rule of psychology. If a pattern of behavior is maintained, then something must be maintaining it. That's basic learning. So what is it about the self-serving bias and the fundamental attribution error that are adaptive responses? Well, first off, it will maintain perseverance. That is, If a person has successes and failures, but always perceives of their failures as being not their fault, but rather the fault of other people, then they'll tend to focus on their successes more. And as a result, when times get lean and there's very few successes, they will perceive and focus on only their successes, and that will more likely keep them responding. The alternative is if you perceive in an accurate sense the number of successes and maybe greater number of failures you have, that would lead to extinction. And with extinguished behavior, you stop responding, and therefore there's no more perseverance. Depression and emotional regulation. We saw those back in the personality chapter. For individuals that have strong external loci of control, who tend to blame the world for controlling them rather than their attempts to control the world as actually being useful, those individuals have a tendency to develop depression and anxiety problems. And so applying the self-serving bias and the fundamental attribution error tends to protect people from becoming depressed and gives them a greater ability to maintain at least a average emotional state so that they don't become depressed or manic in that sense, but they are at least maintaining a useful level of emotional regulation. And of course, their self-concept. What are they going to think about themselves? Well, if you always perceive that you're successful and that your failures are a result of other people interfering with your life, then you will generally have a high positive self-concept. And how that overall applies in social psychology, it can be a number of different ways, but it starts to get a little bit loosey-goosey, but I can imagine you can see in general having a higher self-concept would be adaptive, at least in some sense. Now, how are the self-serving bias and the fundamental attribution error maladaptive responses? Well, your opinion and judgment of other people is always going to be bad, right? If all your successes are because of you and all your failures are because other people or the world interfered with you, then your opinion or judgment of other people is always going to be poor. Therefore, your treatment of other people is oftentimes going to be poor. And in fact, if you treat other people poorly, then you'll simply feel that it is deserved, because other people always bring you down. Other people always block your successes. And so when you treat other people poorly, it just seems justified to you because they're responsible for all your failures. So if you treat them poorly, they deserve it. And of course, your worldview then is going to be extremely poor, right? It's going to be an extremely poor worldview. You're going to see that you, as the only successful person, are awash in a world full of idiots and morons that are destroying everything. And it's only by your great abilities to rise above everybody else will you ever become successful. But everybody else and the entire world in general is simply dragging you down. And so if you treat other people poorly and if your opinion of others is bad, it's because it's simply deserved. They all deserve to be treated poorly and to be viewed poorly. And that is the end of the social cognition section of the social psychology chapter. Next, we'll pick up on a few other topics.